What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode. Today is an exciting one because we're finally putting the mini engine back together. So I have the bottom end assembled, I have the top end assembled. We've got some more parts that need to go onto the block so that we can put this entire assembly into the engine bay. Now I have a decent amount of parts both found on my cart right here, and I also have two little sections over there with a whole bunch of car parts that are going to be thrown on this and assembled. So in today's video, I'm gonna be showing you how to do exactly that. I'm gonna give you the torque specs. I'm gonna show you the proper install sequence for all this stuff. Now, by the end of this video, fingers crossed, we're going to be able to mate the transmission to the motor. So I'm also gonna be showing you guys the new clutch setup that I have that's gonna be able to withstand all this power that's going to the wheels. So let's jump right into it. If you guys saw the last video where I showed you guys how to reinstall everything and assemble your cylinder head, I made a little boo-boo. So do not go ahead and install the exhaust and the intake sprockets just yet, because we need to install the timing chain before that, which means do not install these bolts. So I wasted about $15 worth of bolts. These are torque to yield bolts. So once you install them and put torque on them, you cannot reuse them. So we're gonna have to take these off and put them back on, but I'm gonna show you guys how to put this on there properly. So first things first, we're gonna begin with working with the block. So we're gonna turn this thing upside down. So you're gonna pull this pin, and it's gonna allow you to turn this and rotate the engine 180 degrees. So we're gonna begin with working what's found on top of here. So beginning with the bottom side of the engine, we're going to install the oil turbulence plate. So that slides right over top of here, and it lines up with 4 bolt holes. Now you're gonna be using these 4 bolts here that we removed earlier in the disassembly. These here are 4 10mm bolts. So we're going to be installing these M6 bolts that have a 10mm head onto each one of these, and we're going to tighten them up to 10 foot-pounds of torque. Following that comes installing the oil pump chain, the oil pump, along with the cog that attaches to the crankshaft. So this needs to be all installed in one shot, and it all is going to be facing this way here. So you first install the oil pump chain onto the cog of the oil pump itself. Slide it over top, and you can see that it spins freely. Then you slide this down, and it'll slide right over top of the crankshaft. And just push it into place from down in here. There's going to be 3 T45 Torx bolts that secure the oil pump up to the bottom part of the engine block. Now each one of these bolts needs to be torqued up to 18 foot-pounds of torque. Then with the tape removed from the oil pump, we can go ahead and lay down the oil pan gasket. So the gasket right here is really cheap, it's not expensive. You would use a new one of these every time you take off the oil pan. Now you can use this regular kind of gasket right here, or you can put some silicone around here and it will do the exact same thing. Now I just like this method only because it's a little bit cleaner. But following this, you're gonna get the oil pan itself, and just slightly guide it over top of each of the holes and make sure that it lines up with the gasket. And then we're going to be installing all the bolts that go around the outside perimeter of the oil pan. Now I purchased ARP bolts to replace the standard rusty steel ones that I removed from the engine. So I'll be installing each one of these in each of the 16 holes right here. And then following that, I'm gonna be torquing each one of these bolts to 8.8 foot-pounds of torque. With all the bolts securing the oil pan up to the block, we can turn the engine right side up and begin working on the top side of the engine. So next up, we need to install the cylinder head onto the block. And to do that, I'm gonna be showing you guys how to install a full ARP cylinder head stud kit. Now the benefit of purchasing a kit like this is that you don't ever need to replace your cylinder head studs. So should you for whatever reason need to remove your cylinder head, you can reinstall it without purchasing new fasteners. Another benefit of using an ARP kit like this is that this is actually stronger than the standard bolts that you had before. Because my mini motor is going to be making more power than stock, I'm gonna have some security knowing that these cylinder head studs are not going to stretch and fail on me. So I'm gonna show you guys right now how to install this kit on your car. So if you guys open up your kit, you're going to have all the hardware along with some ARP fastener assembly lubricant. Now this is going to allow you to properly install each one of these fasteners into your block. So I already removed all the fasteners and everything from this kit here, and I also cleaned them up. So actually, before I put this box away, I want you guys to take a look at this. So this here is just white plastic packaging, and you can see that there's a bunch of dirt on the inside. This is not dirt. This is actually oil that they have on all the fasteners so that this doesn't exactly rust when it's in shipping. So you need to clean all of this. After you remove all the studs, washers, and nuts from this kit, you need to go ahead and clean all this up. So I use some parts washer to get that done. Now, after these are completely clean, you're gonna see that in here, there's an install sheet. And this is gonna show you exactly how to install this on your block. And this varies from car to car, so be sure to read all these specifications before you get started with the install. So for this Mini Cooper, we have large studs, we have large washers, large nuts. Yeah, we do. Some smaller ones here, 2 smaller studs, and we have 1 small bolt. Now I also purchased this ARP fastener lube that comes in this amount. This is 10 ounces and it comes with a little brush. Now we're not going to be using this today, but we are going to be using this lubricant. We're also going to need a 16 millimeter 12-point socket along with a 10 millimeter 12-point socket. And we're going to need these once we torque all these fasteners up to the cylinder head. We're going to need a torque wrench, and then you can choose to use a 4 millimeter Allen bit so that we can torque and actually tighten up very carefully each one of these studs up to the block. This 4 millimeter one will only work for these large ones here. You need a 3 millimeter to do these ones. Now that's enough talking for now. I'm gonna grab all these large studs and we're gonna be working on our block. So this right here is the install sheet, and you can see that the torque sequence for all of these nuts, studs, and bolts can be found on the bottom. So all of these large ones here that are found in red, these are the larger M10 studs. The little 2 found right here on the side, these are M8 studs. And then finally, number 13 is our M8 bolt. The machine shop that worked on this engine cleaned out all the threads in there, but if you do not have that done, you will need to chase each and every one of the bolts so that each one of these new studs goes in there and it has a clean mating surface. So we're going to be installing the Allen side of the stud up. Grab the little Allen bit, put it on the top, and then we're going to be putting some lubricant down here. Now you don't need a lot, but you just need a tiny bit so that you get the proper amount of clamping load down on your cylinder head. So you can grab this little tub right here. Now you can choose to use it like this and apply it like that, but it's really difficult to apply the lubricant on there like that. And that's why I purchased a little foam brush like this. This little applicator is gonna help me put it on nicely. So you just dip it inside there, and then you just put a little bit of the lubricant on the bottom of the threads. Following that, you're gonna very carefully make sure you put this in straight. You're gonna tighten this only by hand. Now I have heard of some people's engines coming apart where the cylinder head does not have the proper amount of clamping load onto the block. So what I will do here is, instead of doing this a little bit by hand, once it stops and I can't turn it anymore, I'm gonna turn it just a hair with a ratchet, only so that I know for a fact it's not going to back out. So at this point, I can't turn it anymore. So you just grab your 1/4 inch ratchet and just slightly turn it. There. So at that point, I can't physically remove this if I wanted to by hand. I'm going to repeat that procedure to the following 9 studs that are found right here. So all of those M10 studs, I'm going to get that same procedure done and accomplish that. Now that all the studs are in there tight, we need to install any of the dowel pins that go into the block that guide the cylinder head on there so that it doesn't move. Now there are going to be 2 of them found on this engine, and they're both going to be found on the intake sides right here. So each of these bolts, you can see they've got like a bigger hole to it. So what you do is just grab each of these little pins and they slide down in there. Just like that. And you have to like push them and pinch them in. So you'd put one of them on stud number 9 and then another one on stud number 8. They slide over top and then you just push them into place. Just like that. So when they bottom out, you know that they're good. Now next up comes the head gasket. So there's going to be a piece of metal, let's call it metal, that goes in between the bottom, like the deck of the block, and then the cylinder head. So that there makes so that none of the combustion chambers can basically get to one another, and also the coolant doesn't ever come in contact with the combustion chambers. So I have this one right here from SuperTech. You can see the part number there. This gasket right here is one of the larger ones. This is 0.9 millimeters thick. Now this here is going to decrease the compression ratio of the engine. So I already have 9.5 to 1 compression ratio pistons. And since I'm going to be putting a larger or a thicker head gasket, it's going to increase the volume that's inside the combustion chamber. So keep that in mind if you guys are doing this. So this here, be very careful when you're putting this on. All that it does is just slide right over top of each of the studs. So you can see that it slides over top of each of the little guide pins right here. And everything looks good. So at this point, we can lubricate the tops of each of these threads. So when we put our nuts on here, it's going to be properly lubricated. So you're just gonna grab your little foam brush that we were using before and just lubricate all the threads on these studs. Now following this, we can grab our cylinder head and install it over top of each of the studs. So right now I have both camshafts locked in place with this tool. So you can see there's each one of like the little studs that are just protruding past there. Now I'm going to have to remove this because there's other ones down in there. But we're going to begin by first installing the nuts and the washers on these large 10 main studs before we work on these two on the sides and the other one that's found back here. So next up comes installing each of the little washers along with the nuts for each one of the studs. So on each side of this, you're going to want to lubricate and put a little bit of the ARP lubricant on there. So you're going to have it like this. So you can see there's the lubricant on this side and that side. Once you do it for both, you can just slide it on. And then following that, you can grab one of the nuts, put it over top, and then with your 16 millimeter 12-point socket, you can tighten this up. So once you have the first one on here, you can do the same thing to the other 9, and then you're gonna be torquing each one of these up to 25 foot-pounds. Now that is going to be the first step of 3 for each one of these large M10 studs. Guys, here's a little trick that I learned from doing a couple mistakes while putting these nuts onto the studs. So if you can put that little hex wrench, like the little bit, that you use to torque and basically turn each of the head studs, if you can put that through the nut and then install this end here onto the stud, this will not be able to go anywhere other than on the stud. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so see the little stud that's down there? So I accidentally first dropped this nut down into like the little crevice behind there, and it was a pain in the butt to remove. But if you install the little nut through the hex bit and then you guide it over top, as soon as you have that in and then you let go, it can't go anywhere other than on the actual stud. So once you have it like that, you should then be able to turn it by hand just so that it's on there finger tight. And then from there, you can grab your socket and then tighten this up. As per the torquing sequence, we're gonna first begin with the inside bolts and then we're gonna work our way outwards. So with your torque wrench set to 25 foot-pounds, you're gonna first start off with this one here. So we're gonna tighten until we hear a little click. So that's the first one. Followed by bolt number 2. Then number 3, which is over here. Then 4, which is right above it. So we're essentially trying to do like a circle, let's call it. So we're gonna move to this one here. Now after we do this one, you guessed it, we're going right across from it. After you do 2, you're essentially jumping to the next ones. So this is where we started. We did these 2, then we're jumping now to this side. This here is number 7. Then 8. Followed by number 9 on the opposite side. And then to conclude this torque sequence, we're gonna do this one here, number 10. So that is the first initial stage to this torque sequence. We're then going to replicate the exact same thing where we're going to tighten 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10 at, instead of 25 foot-pounds, up to 50. And then following that, we're going to conclude each one of these large M10 head studs at 75 foot-pounds. Following that, we can install the 2 little studs that we have over here on the sides. This here is number 11 and then 12, and then on the back side is number 13. So I'm going to go ahead and torque away step number 2 and then step number 3. Following that, we're going to finish this up with sequence number 3. With the M10 12-point nuts now torqued up, we can move to the 2 side ones found over here. So in my previous video where I showed you guys how to assemble your cylinder head, I went too far ahead and I actually should not have installed each one of the sprockets for the camshaft. So the exhaust one and the intake ones need to be removed so that we can tighten up both of these. So this one here is not an issue, but the intake camshaft one back here is an issue. So I'm gonna have to remove each of them and then replace each one of these Torx bolts with a new one because these are torque to yield bolts. So they're one-time use only bolts. So just like before with the ARP assembly lube on the washers. You can go ahead and install both of them. So there's going to be 2 of them found back here. Again, this is found in the engine. So once those are on, you can then grab each of the little nuts for the M8 studs. Put some on there too. And these should thread on nice and easily. Now I forgot to put the assembly lube on the actual threads of the studs. So what you can do actually now is with a Q-tip, you can put a little bit of the anti-seize on there, rub it on the inside parts of the threads of the nuts, and then this is going to be properly lubricated. You should audibly be able to hear a difference between having the ARP assembly lube on there and not. It goes on a lot nicer with it. So first thread each of the 2 nuts on by hand. And then after that, we're going to torque each of them up to 35 foot-pounds of torque. We're going to start off with number 11, which is this stud right here. And then we're going to work to the backside, which is found on the intake side. Last but not least, we're going to install the last bolt that's found on the backside of the engine, found right here. So on the backside of the cylinder head, there's one more hole here that requires this fastener along with the washer. So I'm going to be installing a little bit of the ARP assembly lube on the threads and on the front and back side of this little nut. Now last but not least, we're going to torque this up to 25 foot-pounds. Okay guys, so next up comes installing all the timing stuff onto the engine. I have all new timing components, so I have a new sprocket down here for the crankshaft. I have a new timing chain. I'm going to be reusing the old VTC or the Vanos actuator along with the old exhaust sprocket. I have new timing chain guides here. This is the larger one. This here, the tensioner goes on this side, the automatic tensioner. I have a new one of those right here. I have another timing chain guide that goes on top right there. I've got bolts for it. Now, before you put the new chain on your engine, you want to make sure that you let this soak in oil, because that first initial startup is going to be the most important thing. If this isn't lubricated, you could be causing initial wear and you could potentially break it even without putting any kilometers on the car. So I'm going to be putting this, letting it soak inside engine oil for the Mini, and then after that, I'm going to be able to go ahead and install this on my engine. Align the lower cog on the crankshaft. You can then put the Vanos sprocket on the timing chain and then align it onto the intake camshaft with the new bolt. Now you're going to repeat the exact same thing for the exhaust sprocket and the exhaust bolt. Install the crankshaft hub along with the new crank bolt with the dab of oil on the threads. Put a little bit of oil on the hub itself so that it'll install easily on the main seal. With an 18mm socket, turn the crankshaft bolt by hand so it turns the hub and pulls it into the engine. Using new timing guide bolts that have the O-ring, install them on the bottom guides. Install them and tighten them up by hand, and then follow it up with the proper torque spec. Do the same thing with the upper guide that does not have the O-ring. Follow it up also with the proper torque specification. You can find any of those numbers down in the description box if you guys are doing the same thing for your Mini. Next up, we're going to be installing this tool right here that slides into where the tensioner goes. So we're going to first thread this in, and this is going to allow us to put the amount of pre-tension on the chain up here so that we can torque up both of the camshaft sprocket bolts along with the crankshaft sprocket bolt. So you're going to insert this until this doesn't want to move anymore. Back this out. So that's good. Tighten this, and you want to push it so that you put a decent amount of pressure on the timing chain, and then as soon as you start feeling a little bit of pressure, grab a torque wrench and tighten this up to 6 inch-pounds of torque. So as soon as you feel that, stop there, and then we can go ahead and torque up all 3 of those bolts. So both of these fasteners here, they first need to be initially torqued up to 15 foot-pounds of torque, and you're going to be using an E14 socket to get that done. The second part of the sequence to torque up each of these bolts, this now needs to be torqued an additional 90 degrees, and then this bolt here needs to be torqued an additional 180 degrees. Following those 2 bolts, we can torque up the crankshaft bolt down here. Now, in order to torque this properly, we need to install this special tool that goes over top of the little crankshaft hub, and then this right here is what we're going to use to counter the torque from the torque wrench. So we're going to be using the 3 bolts that we had that hold the vibration dampener up to here. Align this up, thread these in. Then with a 1/2 inch ratchet, insert it into the bottom of this special tool. And then with your torque wrench, torque this here initially up to 37 foot-pounds. Following that comes turning this crankshaft bolt an additional 180 degrees. You can then remove the special tool that holds the crankshaft and then replace this with a new harmonic balancer. And then torque each one of these to 20 foot-pounds. We can now remove the special mini timing chain tool. So you're gonna back this off. And then we can replace this entire unit with a brand new timing chain tensioner. Now, when you're installing a new tensioner, you wanna be sure to use a new crush washer whenever you're doing this. Whenever you remove it, you're gonna wanna put a new one on there. So slide that over top. And then we can torque this here up to 48 foot-pounds. Now last but not least, be sure to go underneath the mini motor and remove this little tool right here that locks the flywheel in place. Otherwise, the engine will not turn over when you go to turn the key. If you guys are either doing the same procedure where you're doing a full engine rebuild or you just need to replace your timing chain and guides, it is so crucial to turn the motor by hand initially so that you know that you're not going to be getting any kind of contact. So if you mistimed it or if it jumped something, you'd be able to tell now instead of once you put it back in the car and everything's going to be going. So at this point right here, we can see if there's any mistakes. And if you feel any kind of hesitation when you're turning the crankshaft, you know there's an issue and go back to the engine and double check it. But as it is, this is how we're gonna be finishing up this video. So the mini motor is back together. Now we just have the external peripheral stuff that needs to be bolted up to the block and then it's just a matter of putting it back in the engine bay. So in the next video, I'm gonna be doing all that. I'm gonna be showing you guys the new clutch, the new flywheel. I'm gonna be mating the transmission together to the engine and fingers crossed, we'll be able to get it back in that engine bay. Anyways, guys, if you have any further questions or if you want to find any of the products that I use today, check the description box. I have links for you guys directing you to wherever I bought all these parts, including the tools that I used to get this done. If you have any further questions, comment section's down there. I also have an email if you guys want to reach out to me. You guys know what to do by now. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.